Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the Ridgecrest podcast, where we take time each week to dissect, to dissolve, to assimilate the last week's sermon. With me, as secondly, is Michael Estes, senior lead pastor.
How do you assimilate a sermon?
Just like that.
Dissect and dissolve, I was with you, but dissolve.
Solvents.
Yeah.
Also didn't add, I am Logan Elsie. I am student pastor at Ridgecrest. Michael, how's it going?
It's good. You? Did you have a good Thanksgiving?
Yes, very good. Time off is awesome.
Yeah.
Time back is even better.
Yes, it is.
Love work.
My kids were all so excited to go to school today. Not at all. Last night it began with just massive belly aching about can I just go to school on Tuesday and Thursday this week? I can go Monday, just take off Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I'll go Tuesday, Thursday. It'll be fine.
That sounds reasonable. I mean,
Can you guess which one it is?
number 2.
Nope.
Oh.
She's fine going to school.
Oh, yeah, she's a nerd.
Yep. It was Jackson. 100%.
He's a teenager, though. He's angsty.
Yeah.
He's just unreasonable.
Somebody called him a hipster the other day.
Yeah.
Do you think he's kind of hipstery? I didn't think so either.
He just dresses well.
He does occasionally wear flannel a lot. Like, he likes flannel, but he doesn't like to tuck it in.
I have a take that I think we're kind of past hipsters at this point.
We are.
Hipster, it's always like you have the fringe of fashion and then eventually it just kind of moves on down to everyone else.
Sure.
And like I think we're past hipster. Like everyone's jeans are a little bit tapered. Everyone wears flannel. Beanies are very in. Like it's just kind of where we're at right now. So hot take.
Yeah, I was about to say hot
Hipsters.
take right there.
Hipsters are gone.
Or they've just assimilated into the rest of culture.
See,
That's where.
that's why we say what we're saying.
Yeah. So question of the day:
Uh-huh.
Christmas music, yes or no?
Well, it's technically question of the week. We only do this once a week.
It's true.
I like Christmas music.
Do you listen to it a lot right now?
When Megan's in the car, I listen to it.
So no. What do you listen to on your own?
All kinds of stuff. Podcasts, audiobooks, music.
I don't listen to much music anymore on my own. I listen to a lot of podcasts on my own. Occasionally Christmas music.
Mine definitely goes.
Right now.
If I have an audiobook is first. If I don't have an audiobook, podcast. And then if there's not a podcast that I really want to listen to, music.
I'm listening to a really nerdy podcast right now.
I'm not surprised.
It's shocking, isn't it? They're actually this one in particular is it's called Nerdfest November.
So it's literally a nerdy podcast.
Like this particular version of their regular podcast. So they have a regular podcast, but this one is called Nerdfest November, and they started by talking about Dune, and now they're talking about Star Wars, and they're going to get to Marvel next. And I'm here for all of this, even though I haven't seen Dune yet. I'm a little sad that I haven't seen it.
Did you read the book?
I have not.
Did you read the book?
No.
So
I couldn't finish it.
it's so dense. I started it a couple times, and I was just like,
Fear is the mind killer.
I mean, it is, though.
It gets weird and it gets dark, and I don't do dark. I'm a ray of sunshine, and
Yes, you are.
I understand that books and movies are supposed to get dark, and that thematically we need that or whatever. I just don't need it. I'm not about that.
Yeah.
So things that get super dark when there's a lot of no spoilers, but if there's unnecessary killing, or if there's things that just take a dark turn that's not necessarily necessary, I'm not here for it. Don't like it.
Yeah.
I can count 3 books, all 3 fiction. I have not finished. 4 I've not finished because I'm nope, don't like where this is going. Not a fan.
What are they? Okay. Understood.
One was Dune.
yeah.
One was Game of Thrones. I read the first. I read the first one, and I was like,
same
"Wow!"
Way. It was too much for me.
When you're reading it, and you're like, "Oh wow!"
Yes.
The images.
This is too much. Yep. 100%.
One was by a guy named Brent Weeks. I didn't finish that series. And then there was a third one. I can't remember what it was, but all just took very dark turns where I was like, "Nope."
Yeah.
I like not having nightmares. Let's not do this.
I'm good with that. And so to turn things, we're here to brighten your day.
And your day at the Ridgecrest podcast.
That's right.
So, Michael, you preached a sermon Sunday, you do most Sundays.
Yep.
We wrapped up, right? Mm-hmm. The World Turned Upside Down series, Acts 17. Why aren't you finishing the book? That's a good first question.
Yeah, that is a good first question. Mostly because the phrase that got everything started happened in this particular chapter, and the idea that I wanted us to leave the series with is that we are not different than the church that existed in Acts. We are a part of that church. We exist as an not outpouring, an extension of that church. There we go, an extension of that church. And because we're an extension of that church, we should see ourselves as world changers, just like they were. Even though they didn't phrase it that way, somebody else phrased it that way for them. And so that's where I felt like I needed to stop, was in that spot where that actually happened. There's a lot of really important things that happens after this. Paul has several missionary journeys after this and ends up in Rome eventually. And we don't know exactly what happens to him at the end of Acts. Like, there's some scholars that believe that it's at that point he goes before Caesar and is eventually executed. There are others that make the argument that he, at this point, is released after he meets with Caesar, goes to Spain and evangelizes Spain, and then later on is rearrested and executed later. So there's not a whole lot of certainty about what happens at the end of his life, other than he is executed in Rome, he's beheaded, and eventually buried there. So...
well, you didn't get to one of my favorite verses, which is Acts 20:24. Do you know that one?
I don't know it off the top of my head.
But I do not account my life of any value, nor as precious to myself, if only I may finish my course in the ministry that I received from the Lord Jesus to testify to the gospel of the grace of God.
That's good.
So very upsetting that you didn't read that.
That's Paul, and he's talking to the Ephesian church there, the elders of the Ephesian church. Yeah,
It's just cool.
yeah, that's good stuff.
But my life does not mean anything other than the ministry that I've received. That my purpose, for me, purpose is important.
Yeah.
If there was one Netflix documentary that we could make out of a past event, I don't want to live it by any means, would be when that strand or that string of events that happens to Paul, where he's like on the ship, the ship wrecks, and he's on the island, and he's like freaking out, starving to death, and he gets rescued, and then he makes his way to Rome, and then he deals with Rome. I would love to see, like, however long that took, if I could have like a documentary on that.
Yeah.
That had to be wild.
He had, I mean, just the life that he lived was packed
insane.
So full of things. And he didn't live a long life. Like, considering, our time frame of what a long, full life would look like, it wasn't that long for him. So, yeah, you're right. It would be a fascinating documentary for sure.
So... we've already gotten into it, but why don't you give like a 30-second recap of the sermon, and then we'll dive into some things I think are interesting.
So, summary of the sermon is, if we want to be people who turn the world upside down, we got to do three things. We got to proclaim Jesus as Messiah. We have to stand fast in the gospel, and then we have to say that Jesus is king and Caesar is not. And basically, what I mean by that is we have to say that what we value Jesus above all other things, and so we don't value our allegiance to the country that we live in, or a particular political system, or an economic system, or a way of living higher than we value and pledge allegiance to Jesus. And so he's first and foremost. We are citizens of heaven primarily, before we are citizens of anything or anywhere else. And Micah asked a really good question on the way home yesterday. He was like, what do you mean by turning the world upside down? And I was like, I wish you would have asked that question at the beginning of the series, because I should have given that definition. And what I mean is we upset the social political orders by talking about the fact that the kingdom of this world is temporary and passing, and there's a kingdom that is eternal and of greater value and more important than this world will ever be, and that's God's kingdom. And we're here to install God's kingdom. We're here to inaugurate God's kingdom. So,
isn't it great when children ask you something that's such a simple question, and you're like, man, that's so simple. I didn't think about that. That would have been helpful.
Yep.
Thank you for not being helpful, small child, because then I feel bad. So I want to spend some time talking about Messiahship, our relationship to that, and what that looks like for us in the real world today. But I want to save that towards the end.
Sure.
In the sermon, you spend a lot of time unpacking witnessing, different types of evangelism. So, what evangelism is one of those things where we're an evangelical church.
Yep.
There are some denominations and traditions that care more about it than we do. There's some that care less about it than we do. That look at it in different ways. I know that specifically in a Southern Baptist tradition that we're in, maybe when you growing up were some of this, but it was very much like you had some kind of is it an acronym where it's a word and each letter says a different word? An acronym?
Yep.
You had different one of those, and that was how you shared your faith. There were entire ministries built around walking door to door and saying, hey, if you died tonight, do you know where you would go?
Right.
And like, there's been massive amounts of fruit in that. There's also been massive amounts of anxiety because of that. There's been burned bridges and people not happy with the church because they're just known as door knockers. Once again, there's also been people like you knock on the door and someone's like, please tell me about Jesus. I need this. And so with all that being said, let's just start the conversation with like, is there a right way to evangelize? And if so, is it okay to feel bad about it? Or is it okay to like feel uncomfortable with evangelism?
I won't say there is a singular right way to evangelize because we see in Acts, like it happens a bunch of different ways. Like we have Peter preaching sermons, we have Paul getting into conversations on the Sabbath, we in the synagogue. So he's going specifically to religious people already and having those conversations with a group of people that have a shared interest in the document that he has in hand. We have him go into Athens and he just walks right into the place where the philosophers are and he's like, hey, let's talk about this. And I'm going to present this idea to you. Now let's discuss it. And so you kind of have like a bunch, and you have the example of the Ethiopian eunuch that God takes him to this person and he shares the gospel. I mean, it's just like boom, right there. We have Peter receiving a vision and going to meet with Cornelius. I mean, so you have lots of like different ways it happens. I do think there are wrong ways to do it.
Oh, okay.
So like a wrong way to do it is if you never, ever, ever get to the scriptures. And I don't mean that you have to open a Bible every single time, but like if you never get to something that is scripturally based, you're not sharing the gospel with somebody. You know, if you just say God loves them, that's good, that's right. But if you never say, and here's how he does, Jesus came in human flesh, he was God in human flesh, walked on this earth in perfect obedience because we couldn't. He lived that life that we couldn't live, and then he laid down his life as an atonement for sin. If we never get into those concepts, we aren't sharing the gospel. We're encouraging somebody maybe. We're trying to give somebody some hope. I don't know if it's necessarily a good thing that we do it that way, but there are just all kinds of right ways to do it. There are some wrong ways though, and that's why I hope it didn't come across as I'm taking a shot at the testimony witnessing. But I do think that sharing a testimony is not fully evangelizing a person, just because you're missing out, you're leaving something out if it just stops with a testimony.
Yeah, it's just a part of the puzzle.
Right.
So I have always I've had a tension with evangelism because either because of my personality or my generation or whatever, I absolutely hate, I loathe when people knock on my door at random times to talk to me about anything, whether it's politics or religion or anything, because like, I just don't enjoy it. There's also I've had very awkward encounters when we do like door to door, or you're more, I'm going to call it traditional. I don't know the right word for it. A traditional style of evangelism, which is the knock, knock. If you died today, do you know where you would go? On the other side of that, the training of evangelism, which was done in that style, gives you a very complete understanding of the gospel in terms of like you can say the complete gospel in a few short sentences.
Sure.
And it pushes you. It makes you uncomfortable. It's kind of, I would argue, the expectation is, hey, you're going to do something that makes you extremely uncomfortable for the kingdom. And whereas now, very rarely do I do that style of evangelism, I do think that training was helpful. And so I think when there's people listening that are trying to figure out evangelism, one, they say, I have no idea how to do it. I think it's terrifying. And like what happens next, like after you evangelize. So is that any of those things that you want to speak to? Just to give a quick teaching on it of how to?
I do think that programs are helpful. I don't want that I don't believe in completely non-programmatic evangelism. I do think though that Paul's kind of method that he lays out here, reasoning, explaining, improving, like a lot of that is super conversational, and it's relational in its setup. And I think that we talk about things that matter to us. So like that's the reason that we can have a conversation about Mississippi State football or about the SEC. Baseball or whatever. We talk about things that matter to us. And if we are dwelling on spiritual things, it should just come out of our conversation. We should be able to just, hey, have you ever thought about this? Or what do you think about this?
Right.
Instead of, if you died tonight, would you go to heaven? There's a lot left open to interpretation in something like that. I think a better question is, have you ever thought about Jesus? Like, what do you think about Jesus? And just kind of launch out from there. Because we live in a place that is, I would say, quasi-religious, in the sense that even if people aren't regular church attenders or whatever, they have some literacy in Christianity, in Christendom. Maybe not in the Bible. I found this to be the case whenever I was teaching and I would make allusions to Scripture because I'd see it in the literature that we were reading. They would not understand what I was talking about. Like I would say, have y'all ever heard of so-and-so? And they would look at me like, I don't know what you're talking about. And so I would have to explain and give some Bible. And these were kids that attended church on a regular basis. I say regular basis. On a semi-regular basis.
Not our students.
Yeah.
Our students could teach Bible classes.
Absolutely. That's because Logan does doing such a great job. So he is.
They definitely could.
Yeah.
Not.
But I think the thing that we can do is we can say the name Jesus, and people are going to have at least some sort of opinion
Some understanding.
on him. And we can go from there and say, okay, now tell me what you think about him. Tell me why you think the things you do about him. Tell me what you think about yourself. Like, people are going to talk about themselves. Are you a good person? What does that mean to be a good person?
Right.
And you can get into all kinds of really interesting discussions, and then those discussions eventually lead to that opening. If you ask a person tell me, do you think you're a good person?
Yes.
Okay, now tell me what you mean by that, and then you can kind of walk down the road of.
Oh, I thought you were asking me.
Oh, yeah, I think you're a good person, Logan. But and you can go all kinds of places with the answer to those questions, and you'll find a way into the gospel really easily. It's just a matter of I think probably one thing that our people, all of us, could benefit from is knowing what are the right questions to ask. I do think that we live in a world that is less spiritual, and I mean less supernatural. I'll put it that way. So in the past, like it was nothing to believe that there was a God who created the universe, or gods that created the universe, and it was the universe was full of spirits and the spiritual things and supernatural things. And now we think we can explain everything by science, and we don't really need supernatural things to be able to do that. And so I think there probably is some pre-evangelism that has to happen now.
What does that mean? What is pre-evangelism?
So before you get to the gospel, let's say I ask a person what they think about Jesus, and they're like, I don't even think there's a God. Well, there's some steps that we have to go through before we even get to Jesus at that point. So do you believe that miracles can happen? Well, no. I mean, I think everything can be explained by science. Well, at that point, then you just have to, there are steps along the way that you have to go down. So I do think, there are some questions that we probably need to ask that help us understand where these people are and how we can help them get to the gospel. But I think, the question, that's where, where Paul says he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. That was literally him taking a passage and asking them what they thought about it, and then he responds to their response. I mean, that's the way that it was dialogue between the two of them. That's a lot less intimidating to me than I'm going to go knock on a stranger's door, and then we're going to have a conversation that may be long or may be short, and I have no idea what it's going to look like, and I have a script, and if anything goes off script, I don't know what to do.
Mm-hmm. So there was a book that I had to read. I was going on a trip to Southeast Asia, and we were visiting. We're going to a Muslim state, Muslim country, and they asked us to read a book called Any Three. It stands for anyone, anywhere, anytime. That's the Any Three.
Yeah.
But can't remember half of what's in the book. But the premise of the book was very Socratic in how they do evangelism. Is you ask questions and you don't stop asking questions until they start asking questions about Jesus. Basic premise of the book. And the reason for that was it was based off of a Muslim country because, in a Muslim state, you can't necessarily just run out and start proclaiming Jesus. Right. You can have, especially if you're a tourist, you can have your own Christian faith. And so the way that it would work is you go up to someone and say, hey, what do you believe? Oh, you're Muslim. Shocker. What does that mean? What does it mean for you to be a Muslim? I hear that there are pillars. What are these pillars? So if you do these, you go to heaven. Well, so not necessarily. So how do you know if you're going to heaven or not? Oh, you really don't know. Even Muhammad doesn't know if he's going to heaven. That's really strange because what I believe is blah, 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 blah. And and you just keep asking questions.
Right.
And I think it's important because one, a lot of times, like you said, when you're running by a script, when you're running by a thing, you want it to be quick, fast, and dirty, and you're wanting people to just come up with a decision, yes or no, so that you can move on and go to the next house. Right. And I think one of the ways that we miss and one of the weaknesses we have is, I think just as in general, we're unwilling to sit in awkwardness. We're unwilling to be uncomfortable, especially in conversation. I think that's where people don't like disagreeing because it's uncomfortable. It's awkward. And so you either don't have a conversation with them or you immediately escalate in order to end the conversation. That's right. And I think when we can sit in uncomfortable silence or uncomfortable conversations of where we disagree spiritually, I think that's where growth happens. And I think part of that is you've got to be, you don't have to know everything, but you have to at least think for yourself and know what you believe, because if you're asking them to know what they believe, then you better know what you believe. And using that method, it's just I've found more fruit out of that than anything else, especially with students, but even with people in different countries, because it's part of it is, especially with students, you're just trying to get them to think and get them to think. I can't tell you how many students that I've talked to where I've said, what do you think about God? And they're like, I don't know. I'm like, well, what do you think about spiritual things? And they're like, I don't think about spiritual things. I think about school. I think about girls. I think about video games or sports or whatever. I just don't think about those things. Yeah. And it's like you said, we're so spiritual now that it's just not. It's not just not a priority. It's not in the ballpark. And so.
Yeah, to piggyback on what you were saying, I remember while you were talking about that, I remember an experience I had when I took a student group up to White Plains, New York to help with the church plant there. And there was a huge Jehovah's Witness population there. And part of what we were doing was, some of what we were doing was just surveys. We were just talking to people about, religious beliefs and would they be interested in going to a church and that sort of thing. That started all kinds of conversations. Well, I got into a conversation with a pair of ladies that were Jehovah's Witnesses on basically a street bench. They let me sit down with them and talk to them. And one of them would not really engage with me, but the other one started to ask me questions, and I started to ask them questions. And we got to a couple of things, but we had a shared interest in Jesus and the Bible because they had beliefs about Jesus and I had beliefs about Jesus, and we needed to be able to differentiate between the two. And they were trying to get me to see something, and I was trying to get them to see something. And we got to a place where this young lady, we got to a parable of Jesus where he talks about the Lazarus and the poor man, and this is a different Lazarus than the one that comes out of the tomb, not Jesus' friend, but a different guy altogether. And Lazarus dies and goes to hell. And the poor man who sat at his table and he would never feed ends up in heaven, and they see each other in this parable. And the Lazarus is like, "Can you help me?" And anyways, I looked at her and I knew that a part of Jehovah's Witness beliefs were simply annihilation. When you die and you're not going to heaven, you're just completely annihilated. You're gone. You just don't exist anymore. And I said, what do you do with this parable? And she was like, well, I don't know. I mean, because she was like, well, it's a parable. And I was like, yeah, but it's a parable, but it's based in some sort of reality. Like there's something going on here that we have to explain. And she got to a point to where she was like, well, I really don't know the answer to your question. I'm going to see what I can find out. And she
Which
gave
is a great answer.
Yes. But like you said, what it did was we were both thinking about what we were believing.
Right.
And I had an answer to that question. The same things would be happening with Paul. I guarantee it. He'd be talking about Isaiah 53. They would be like, the people in the synagogue would be like, well, I don't know who this person is. Mm-hmm. And Paul's like, I know who that person is. Mm-hmm. And here's who that person is. And they could be at that point, oh, yeah, I see what you're saying. And they would adopt that belief, and all of a sudden they would follow Jesus. And there'd be other times where they'd be like, no, I'm not there. I'm not going to believe that. And so it really does open the door to all kinds of really interesting conversations and a very more comfortable way to share the gospel than, hey, stranger, I don't know. I want to tell you about Jesus, and they don't even know what you're talking about half the time. And it can be effective, but it's just less likely, in my opinion. I don't know if that's the right way to say that. It's harder.
I think there are pros to both. And there are definitely cons to both. I love the fact that with traditional, I'm calling it traditional, but everybody knows what I mean. Using a program-based Southern Baptist style. It's not just Southern Baptist, but that approach, it gives you some kind of a framework.
Yeah.
It makes sure that you don't miss anything, and it pushes you.
Yes.
Because so often people are like, well, I like relational evangelism. I like to just, become best friends with the person and take them out to coffee. And then when they ask me about my faith, then I'll respond with this great thing, and I'll give them a Bible, and they'll cry, and it'll be great. Like, then what happens? You never do that because that just so rarely happens.
That's right.
Instead, these are people who are like, I think the gospel is so important that I'm going to go out and bring it to people. I'm going to expand the kingdom of God. The con and the struggle with that is those are usually very quick conversations. They're usually very rote conversations, and they don't inspire relationship.
That's right.
And then I think the beauty of the more relational is you care about the person and want to have longer, deeper relationships with that person in order to bring them to the gospel. Obviously, the con is you can get stuck in that passivity sometimes.
Yeah, I definitely think that there are pros and cons to both. And we could spend a lot more time on this probably, but one of the things that I pointed out in the sermon was the fact that Paul did this over the course of 3 Sabbaths. And a lot of times we think of evangelism as a one-shot thing, like boom, I did that thing and it's over, and it worked or it didn't work. And working and not working is a completely different conversation. What does it mean that the evangelism worked? Because there was a convert, it worked, or if we shared the gospel and they didn't believe it, did we fail? That's a whole different conversation. And is the point to get a convert or to make a disciple? Because the reality of the situation is what happens a lot of times in our circles is that the point was all along to make converts, and we forget about the whole discipleship part, and that's where we get 10, 15, 20 years down the road, and we have a group of people that are just like, I'm not sure how to share my faith. I'm not sure how to pray. I'm not sure how to read my Bible. I'm not sure what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And so that's why Paul would, he would evangelize an area. He would share the gospel with people. And then he didn't just leave them alone for the rest of their lives. He left people in place that knew what they were doing. And then he also would write back to them and say, hey, I want to encourage you in the faith. I want to check on you. I want to know how you're doing, that sort of thing.
Well, and I would even go so far as to say that the goal of evangelism is not to make a convert or necessarily a disciple. It's just to be faithful to the calling that God has for us.
Absolutely.
So often we're so product-based and answer-based. It's like, oh, I failed if I don't have any converts. And God just calls us to be faithful. Right. We are just the tools by which he moves in this world. And he could be using you and your faithfulness for something 40 years down the road that you never see or know about. So often we hear the stories about, like, somebody came, someone fell down on the spot and believed in Jesus, or someone came to me 6 weeks later and said, hey, because you talked to me, I became a Christian. And all those are great.
Mm-hmm.
But so many times there are things that happen that, like, you have no idea. Like, you are one very small piece in such a larger plan.
That's right.
That you won't know this side of heaven that you had any part in that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it took a huge weight off of my shoulders to know that I'm not a failure if nobody believes in Jesus because of what I say, or if no one comes to the faith in my presence.
Mm-hmm.
Like, my job is just to go and to be faithful.
Yes, I agree.
Ooh, we preaching now.
That's right.
So we don't have a king or a queen. We're not a, patriarchal?
We're not a monarchy.
Monarchy. Thank you. That was a word. Makes sense of me as a 21st century American Christian what kingship and messiahship, why that's important and why it should be important to me.
Well, it's biblical, first of all. We see the fact that in the Old Testament prophecies that Jesus, or the Christ, the Anointed One, would be king, would be ruler over all things. All things would be subjected to him. All things would have to bow down to him. And so for us, what that means, and again, this was easier for people that lived under the monarchical system.
See, it's weird when you have to use it in a sentence.
When they lived under that type of political system, like what that meant was the king had absolute sway, absolute rule. Every part of your life was colored by that king's kingship. And so whatever they prioritized, whatever that they said we should care about or do, that was the thing that went, and that was the thing that was prioritized by the people. And that, depending on the king, that could be a good or a really terrible thing. We see in the history of Israel, a lot of times kings absolutely abuse their power and set up kingships that benefit them and them alone and are all about them, receiving glory and getting whatever they want. And that's part of, if you go back to the very beginning where the monarchy is set up in Israel, Samuel's like, they're rejecting you, God, as their king. They want another king. And God's like, I know they are. I understand that. Give them what they want. And what they're going to find out is that these human kings are going to take things from them over and over and over again. They're going to take their cattle. They're going to take their men, their women. They're going to use them as soldiers. They're going to use them as their wives. They're going to take away all of these things that they think they're actually going to protect. And what that does for us is it helps us understand that we weren't meant to have a human king. We weren't meant to have somebody in our life that was absolute ruler over all things except for God himself. And Jesus rules as God in human flesh, rules as the sovereign king, and he is the only one that can do it well and right and those sorts of things. And so, anyways, for us in our modern day, it means that we talk a lot about rights. And what it means is that for us, we lay down all those rights, we lay down all those privileges and say whatever Jesus says goes. Our rights are subjected to his will. Now, that sounds super scary until you actually get to know Jesus. And you're like, everything that he does is really for our benefit, for our growth, for our good. And so it's easier to lay down your rights whenever and this goes back to like the relationship between husbands and wives, and Paul talks about, wives submitting to their husbands. That's really hard to do when a husband is not loving his wife sacrificially. But when a husband loves his wife as Christ loves the church with this sacrificial love, then it's a whole lot easier to lay down and say, I'm going to submit to everything that you want to do. And so, again, I know why it sounds foreign to us, because everything we really believe in and think about as a culture is all like, I need to protect my rights, I need to care about myself. We're very individualistic, and having a king doesn't really suit that very well.
No, as a, quote, free man in a, quote, free country, putting any rights down does not sound fun.
But see, and we talked about this not long ago, is our understanding of freedom is totally skewed. right? You're reading a book by John Mark Homer, Live No Lies. Is that what the name of it is? I think it's.
Yeah.
And he talks about it in there. I've read it in another place as well. I think it was in Alan Noble's newest book called You Are Not Your Own. Our understanding of freedom is the absolute ability to choose whatever we want at all times. That's not freedom as the Bible describes it.
No. Very wise people centuries ago would have called us just people destined for misery.
Mm-hmm.
Because instead of having the complete freedom to do whatever you want, you're pulled by everything.
That's right.
Every desire pulls you to and fro, which the Bible speaks about that.
Yes.
And so true freedom is not the ability to do everything. It's the ability to have self-control from everything so that you can choose to do the things that you want to do and not have your body, your flesh control you and push you to every single whim.
That's right.
So that's foreign to us. It's not what the world that we grew up in told us to do, which is do whatever you want, do anything
Follow
that
your
you
heart.
want.
I mean, Disney princesses have told us for years and years and years, follow your heart. I don't know if they told me and you, but
Hey, I love a good Disney princess movie.
that's right.
Like Mulan.
Cartoon or live action?
I haven't seen the live action.
That's really good.
I'm sure it is.
I thought it was pretty good. Steven, no? No. Oh, okay. I thought it was pretty good. Okay.
Never saw it. Wasn't Mushu not in the live action?
Wasn't in the that is correct. That's true.
He's the main character, in my opinion.
A lot of people would say it's Mushu's story.
Ooh, we can't get in this on this episode.
Okay.
So
Deep dive.
how does one live under a Messiah, under the reign and rule of an invisible God who doesn't tell us how to be an accountant or doesn't tell us how to be a school teacher, or how does that look like? Because so often I forget that God even exists. Like I'll go through my entire day and, if I had a king, the king is in every newspaper. He would be on every news program. He would be on Twitter. He'd be everywhere. And I would never forget him because their reign is so over my life. But with Jesus, I forget that he even exists or is real half the time. And then everybody around me doesn't believe that he exists. So how do I live under that?
Well, I think a huge part of that is knowing what he wants from us. And the way we do that is through his word. This is going to sound like a really cliche answer, but regular Bible reading, Bible study is essential to being under the Messiahship of Jesus. I mean, and what I mean by that is not simply we need more information. We need to be reminded daily that we have a king. We need to be reminded daily, because media does that, for us now. We have 24/7 news cycle, 365. There's not a day that CNN or Fox News takes off. They are there all the time. There's that little crawl that's constantly moving across the bottom of the screen telling us what's happening in the world, or that version of what's happening in the world, or whatever. It's there all the time. It's always in our face. We need to be reminded on a regular basis that God is there and that he is in control, that he rules all of these things. And then the other part where you talked about he hasn't told me how to be an accountant or a teacher or a lawyer or whatever it is that I've been called to be. Again, and we talked about this a little bit last week, he may not have given us the specifics of, now when you're bouncing the books, this is what you do, but he has given us principles that are really helpful in understanding how we approach all these things. So when we think about that, I think about a passage like Romans 12 that kind of gives me a guideline for how to live all of life. Romans 12, verse 9, let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil, hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. Don't be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in the spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. And he goes on from there and he gives more kind of principles for living. And I think to myself, okay, as a teacher, what could I do to show honor to my students? What could I do to show my students that I love them? That love comes out of a place of deep love that I've received. What can I do to rejoice in hope in front of other people? What can I do to be patient in tribulation? You know, like if my boss is being really tough on me that day, how am I patient in that? And what does that manifest in me as far as behavior? And so the King has spoken to us. It's just a matter of whether or not we access what he said to us on a regular basis. So I think that's probably the way we do it. That's at least a good start. Prayer is obviously something that we should access. I read a really good book over the Thanksgiving break. It's real short. It's by Donald Whitney, who's, I know you and I are both kind of fans of his spiritual disciplines books. It's called Praying the Bible. And literally all it is he's like a program that he's taught about how you want to learn how to pray. Here's what you need to do. You need to open the Psalms, and you need to begin to pray the Psalms, because you're like, well, I really don't know what to pray, or I say the same things every single time I pray. And he's like, listen, all you do is you pick up the book of Psalms and you go verse by verse, and he's like, you pray whatever comes to mind as you read that verse. It doesn't have to be an interpretation of that verse. You're not trying to do that. You're using God's words and praying God's words back to him. These are the things that matter to him, so they should matter to us too. And so as you read through a psalm and you're like, let's say one of them is Psalm 116, 15. I saw that one just a couple days ago. Precious in the sight of the Lord are the death of his saints. And you know somebody in your church that has recently lost a loved one. And you can literally pray back to God, I know this person was precious to so-and-so. Please be with them. Take care of them. And all of a sudden, like, you're supplied with vocabulary, and you're supplied with thoughts, and you're supplied with a plan to do that. And the way he actually breaks it out is really helpful. He said there's 5 Psalms a day, and this is what you should do. You don't pray 5 Psalms a day. You take the day of the week. You got like 30 days most months. And you take, so say it's day 1, it's, December the 1st. You take Psalm 1, Psalm 31, Psalm 61, Psalm 91, Psalm 121. So you break them out 30 days, or 30 Psalms apart. You just read over those 5 Psalms. You don't have to read them carefully. Just really glance at them really quickly and say, I'm gonna pray this Psalm today. And then you just pray your way through that Psalm, and you have literally accessed, your ability to communicate with that King. Go before the King, talk to him, and you don't have to come up with. Think about how nerve-wracking it would be to go and talk to a king. If
Big
you didn't
deal.
know what you were going to say, you're like, I'm winging this thing right now.
Right.
That would be terrifying. But God, in His mercy, has given us the very words that we're supposed to pray. And we just don't do it that way. And so anyways, I know that's a long tangent right there, but I think Bible reading and prayer are just the way for us to know what it means to live under the kingship of Jesus.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things where people are like, it's very cliche and it's the Sunday school answer. But A, it's because it's effective.
Yes.
And 2, just because you think it's boring does not mean it's not effective. It means that you're most likely not doing it very well.
Yeah.
And you just need some tools in order to do it better.
Yeah.
So as we're starting to land the plane, we're talking about Messiahship. We're talking about living in America. Lots of political fun things that happen.
Sure.
If I want to get serious about following Jesus and living under his messianic reign and rule, how does that influence and affect my political world? Does that mean like we go straight political anarchy where we burn everything to the ground like American, and we just read the Bible and we don't pay our taxes? Do we try to take over the Republican Party and make that the Christian party of conservative evangelical Christians, or the opposite? Or do we just, is there a middle ground? Can you even have a middle ground today?
Yeah. Here's the deal. We're never going to fit. Like, we're never going to completely fit into one way or the other, because those are human systems developed by humans about human concerns. They're not. Their focus is never going to be eternal. They are trying to set up all political systems, whether they're democracy or communism, whether they're socialism or monarchy, whatever they are. All of them are trying to build heaven on earth. I mean, that's what they're trying to do. And we've seen in the Tower of Babel that fails miserably. It's because it can't happen, because if you try to build any of those things apart from God, it's going to fail and it's going to be miserable. And we also have words from Jesus that tell us, hey, you pay taxes to Caesar. You give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and you give to God what is God's. And so there is like this middle way between I'm going to go straight political and I'm going to sanctify everything in this kind of baptize everything in this understanding of Christianity and say I'm going to create a political party that's totally Christian and that sort of thing. And then there's this other extreme where we just completely separate the two, and there's the sacred world and the secular world, and those two don't mingle or mix in any way. And so I have my Jesus life over here and my political life over here. I don't think either one of those are the right way to do it, because Jesus didn't give us a full political system. He wasn't trying to set up necessarily a political party. He was trying to inaugurate his kingdom. And so we have his words on that, and we also have Paul's words in Romans 13. I just talked about Romans 12. Romans 13 follows right after it and says, you need to let every person be subject to the governing authorities. And he kind of walks through, this is what it looks like to be subject to the governing authorities. So it's not that we're out trying to just tear down systems, but what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring in the kingdom of God wherever we are, and if that affects the political systems, if that changes and upsets the social order, that's okay. But we're not necessarily trying to overthrow governments. We're not trying to, tear down. Paul did not see it as his mission to tear down the Roman Empire. He saw it as his mission to spread the kingdom of God wherever he went. And the rest of that just kind of was fallout from what he did. In fact, people could make the argument that the Roman Empire existed longer because Paul did the work that he did in giving the Roman Empire some sort of unifying social, religious order that didn't exist before. That's a whole big old historical argument that we don't have time for right now.
It's very difficult to figure out. I don't know, because on one hand, like, what you think is right, and then on the other hand, like, you want to make changes. The other hand, either A, you get so into it that it becomes your life and you don't know what to do, or you just get so fed up with it, you're like, just get me the heck out of here. And so
I don't think we're called to be apolitical.
Yeah.
I don't think we're supposed to just bow out of politics and say we're not. We're supposed to live our Christian life in the public square. And so that's going to have effects on our politics, on our social beliefs, on the way we view economic things, the way we spend our money. It should have an effect on all those things. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. But we also have to let it have full effect. And so what I mean by that is we can't take partial truths of the gospel and say, this is what I'm going to shape my understanding of politics around. It has to be a fully formed, this is a gospel thought. It affects all of these things. And so we may find ourselves without a political party to attach ourselves to, especially in America. I mean, we may not be able to say, I fully align with this party or I fully align with this party. At that point, it becomes, super complicated and complex as far as, okay, who do we vote for and how do we make those decisions about who we vote for and those sorts of things.
As well as if you go the opposite way, where you are aligned with the political party, you tend to make enemies out of your brothers and sisters who disagree with you. And which
we're obviously told not to do.
Not what we're called to.
Yeah.
I had a student one time, not at this church, it was the previous church, where he wasn't a Christian. He didn't go to the church I was at. And I was like, man, what is it about Christianity that you just don't want to be a part of? I was like, because you are a smart kid. I know you're thinking about things. Why do you not want to be a part of this stuff? And he's like, I can't be a Christian. And I was like, why? And he said, because I'm a Democrat. And I was like, how far we have gone to the point to where we're so ingrained with politics to where if someone is not a conservative Republican, then it just means automatically you're not allowed within our walls. And it was just very telling that an 8th grade boy thought that I can never be accepted by Jesus because my politics don't align with the American Republican Party.
That's tough.
It is tough. And I think, and that goes on the opposite side too. I'm sure there's people who were like, there's no way that Republicans are Christians. But the point is we've gotten so ingrained that that's the default. Is we're so ingrained in it that people think if I believe this or don't believe this, I'm not allowed within the kingdom of God, which is supposed to be defined by grace and not by party lines.
Yeah.
So things to think about. So if you've made it this far,
Yep.
congratulations. You made it through a politic talk and evangelism talk. Two things that make people wildly uncomfortable.
That's right.
So I want to end with my question, which is, if there was one hobby / activity that you're not currently doing that you wish you were proficient at, what would it be?
That's a good question.
Something you're not already doing that you wish that you could do and were good at.
I think it would be some sort of like crafting, artistic thing, like painting or woodworking or something like that. I think woodworking would be a lot of fun, and very like stress relieving. I like to make things, or well, I know what it is. It's because it's not really a hobby. It's something I do because we need to survive. But baking. I love making food, and making food makes people happy, and I like making people happy as well. And so, baking would be kind of right up. If I could just make.
I think
it a
you would
hobby.
like baking, specifically baking, because it's so precise. It's very measurement oriented. It's like you're making like a chemistry experiment.
Yeah. Lots of fun. What about you?
I don't know if you would consider learning languages a hobby. I would love to know multiple languages, and if that doesn't count, I would like to learn an instrument.
Yeah.
Just because those are things that I was in an athletic family, and so we didn't do instruments or music,
Right.
and so I never even I've never taken lessons. I've never done any of that, and so I think it'd be cool.
If
to
I ever
do
did
that.
an instrument, I'd have to take lessons. I could not be self-taught. I just don't have enough discipline in that area to do that. It'd have to be something where like there's an accountability there that somebody could like check on me and make sure I'm actually doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
Right.
Baking, I could kind of do that on my own. I mean, I'm going to test the food. It's going to be great.
Cookbook, recipe,
That's right. Let's do it.
YouTube, stuff like that. All right. Well, consider this plane officially landed. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at all of our emails. You can go on the website and find all of that. Feel free to tune in to YouTube, Facebook, all the other videos that we got going on. Don't forget that Ridgecrest students live streams every Wednesday. We have lots of views. It's very exciting. You should be part of it. Any other things we need to talk about?
No, we got Christmas coming up, Christmas programs and stuff coming up. It's going to be great.
Other than that, come see us. And we already said other than that. We will see you next time.